Thank you. All right, hi, welcome. My name is Karen Liu. I am the Pitt Global Hub Manager under the University Center for International Studies. Thank you so much for being here with us for another in-person event in our What's in a Name series. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that we are currently on unceded Osage and Shawnee lands, and that this brief land acknowledgement is only a small part of supporting Indigenous communities. We hope that this land acknowledgement can inspire others to continually recognize Indigenous communities and stand in solidarity with Native nations. So just to start off, I'm going to give a little bit of context about our What's in the Name series. This series aims to open a doorway to explore issues that affect us every day and that ultimately reverberate through the most intimate aspects of who we are. While we will explore basic tools and name etiquette with the kindness and respect we all deserve, we intend to reflect about what our names say about us and how they may be used to define who we are. We've hosted events on topics such as name bias, microaggressions in names, and legal names and the LGBTQIA+ experience. Our program today will be an introduction to place names and how they impact and reflect upon our identities, how we are perceived, and how we navigate the frameworks they set in motion. This session will be an introduction to place names and their significance as a part of a community's identity, touching upon themes of colonialism, enslavement, migration, and more. So I'm very excited to present our first featured speaker, Dr. Ruth Mostern, an associate professor of history and the director of the World History Center here at Pitt. Dr. Mostern is also the project director of the World Historical Gazetteer and author of the recently published book, The Yellow River, A Natural and Unnatural History, published by Yale University Press in 2021.
Thank you. I'm going to need a minute to get mic'd up here, so please be patient and let me thank, you know what, I'll stand here and let Karen organize me, and in the meantime, thank her warmly for the invitation to participate in this event and to be part of this What's in a Name series, which is something that I spend so much time thinking about as a historian working on place name history. Are we good? Are we good to go? Okay.
Is that comfortable?
Beautiful. It is comfortable. I am doubly mic'd here and yet somehow not experiencing feedback, so this is great. So again, thank you so much to the Center for Latin American Studies for hosting this series on the significance of names. And oh, you know what I don't have? I don't have my clicker. There, I do have another thing to pick up here. Okay. So I'm here to talk about. Nope, I'm not yet here to do anything. Hang on. There we go. Okay. So we don't think a lot, I think, about names, which is why I am so enthusiastic about the fact that the Center for Latin American Studies and USIS is hosting this series. And in particular, we don't think a lot about place names. And the proposition that I want to make in this talk is that a place, when we say that there's a place, that this is Posvar Hall, or that this is the University of Pittsburgh campus, or that we're in the Oakland neighborhood, or the city of Pittsburgh, we're actually making a proposition about three different things. One is that there's some location, right? There's a spot on the Earth's surface that is the thing that we're talking about. A second is that there's some label, there's some word that describes that location. And then the third is that there's something that happens at that place. Something makes that place meaningful to people, right? That we are here because we're here to see a talk. We may all have a lot of associations with this building as a place where we work or learn or teach. We may remember conversations that we have here. And so when we talk about a place, we're talking about all those three things at once. The place, the events and sense of place, and the fact that there is some word, maybe many words, and that's really what I'm going to talk about, that have described or might describe that setting for activity. And to start out with, I have a couple of examples that I really like pointing towards to just kind of unsettle the notion of what place is and to kind of start us thinking with the fact that it might be much more complicated than we tend to think. And the first one is this example on the left. It's a 2021 news story where there was a farmer in Belgium who was plowing his fields, found a rock in an inconvenient location, moved the rock, and later on a local history buff was out wandering through the countryside and discovered that that stone was actually a boundary marker marking the border between France and Belgium. And the final paragraph, I just screenshotted a little bit of this BBC News story. The last paragraph was, instead of causing international uproar, the incident has been met with smiles on both sides of the border, right? And this sort of gets at all three of those concepts that I'm talking about here, right? That some point on the Earth's surface might be called France or Belgium, that what it means that it is called that thing meant something different to the farmer plowing his fields, to the history buff walking around that location, and of course the very specific geopolitical context of these two friendly EU countries. This would have been a very, very different story if it were happening, for instance, on the border of Russia and Ukraine. And so the idea of France as a place, Belgium as a place, gets sort of troubled in interesting ways when we think about this story. Closer to home, 5 minutes walk away from here, this story on the right, that Pittsburgh's Columbus statue, right by Phipps Conservatory, right on the other side of the bridge over here, is now wrapped in plastic, right? It is no longer the site of a Columbus statue. The plaque has been removed. The name has been removed. What it is the site of instead is this tented entity. And so what I'm really focusing on here is this idea of a location staying the same while the label that refers to it changes, and because a new event has happened there. Something has happened to reformulate what that location is supposed to mean and what kinds of activities are supposed to be happening there. And so what this is getting at is the idea that place is not about geography, place is not about name, place is about a coming together of all of these three aspects of the name, the location, and the spatial settings for human activity. And I'm calling out here on the right-hand side of the slide one of my favorite books and websites. It's by someone named David Turnbull. It's called Maps or Territories, Science is an Atlas. It's a series of exhibits that are about, sort of digital exhibits, that are about this concept of thinking about maps, thinking about place, and understanding how to make these concepts more complex. And David Turnbull there, the second person I've called out in this set of bullet points, the author of this set of exhibits, calls that indexicality, right? And indexicality is the idea that some concept, right, and in the case of this book, thinking mostly about maps, are legible, explicable, and meaningful only to people for whom they are, right? They're not generally meaningful. And the example, for instance, about the French and Belgian border is one good example of that. The fact that that border stone marks something meaningful is only meaningful if it's meaningful. It's meaningful only in context. A couple of my other favorite concepts for thinking about this, the archaeologist Tim Ingold, introduces the idea of taskscapes, that we're not thinking about landscapes as simply locations on the Earth's surface, but that we're thinking about the way that they're constructed by people engaging in activities that change the people, change the societies, and transform the places themselves. And then finally, three concepts, topos, koros, and geos, which I'm going to talk about in a little more detail on this next slide. So the idea of this article, Michael Curry is a geographer at UCLA, and in this article, what he's doing is trying to sort of decenter the map and decenter the idea of spatiality as it's represented on a map. And so what he says is that geos, right, the geos of geography, is actually the most recent, right? These are all concepts that come up in ancient Greek rhetoric and writing about space and place, but that the idea of geos is actually the most modern one. You don't have the ability to make maps until you have mathematics, until you have writing implements, until you have measurement techniques, right? And that there are plenty, for thousands of years prior to that, people made meaning in the physical space that they inhabited. The earliest way that they did that was through a concept called choros, which is an idea that comes originally out of divination. It's the idea that wherever you're situated on the Earth's surface, it is there because it's somehow related to something happening in the heavens. There are ritual experts who can say, the reason I know that you're here is because I know what's happening up there. It's the this is here, this is where you are way of thinking about place. And then after that, further on, when you get into oral storytelling, the great age of epics, you see the notion of topos, the idea that places aren't just meaningful because they're one place that draws its meaning from the cosmos, but because we can tell stories about them. We can connect the fact that we are here in Posvar Hall to the fact that there's such a thing as the University of Pittsburgh campus, to the city of Pittsburgh, to Carnegie Museum and Library and CMU. We make meaning in these places by connecting them to one another and telling stories about them. And the thing that is really, one of the things I want to stress here is that for me as a historian, as a person who focuses on text and narrative, I love maps. Everybody loves maps, right? But that most of the way that we make meaning about space and place isn't about maps at all. It's through that kind of storytelling and placemaking type of activity, those choros and topos kinds of activity, which in the context of this series is what we can think of as place naming activities, right? Events of placemaking, like the ones I've been talking about in this talk. And that maps, right, we don't use, right, once again, we don't use maps very much. Maps were not very common for most of history. Again, now, when we get wayfinding through our phones, we're not seeing a continuously oriented version of space. We're getting a narrative. We're saying, make a left turn here, make a right turn there, go another 3 miles, get off at the next exit. We live, once again, almost exclusively in topos world, even in our day-to-day lives. And so another thing, so that's a range of things that it means to think about place and place names. Another thing that place is about is that place names reflect networks and relationships. And another one of my favorite maps, and this also comes from that David Turnbull book, that Maps or Territories book book and website that I talked about, that this is a 17th century map from in what is now South Carolina, indigenous map of territory. It is not about the exact geospatial location of things. It's not about their exact size or dimensions, right? It's not about making border lines. It's about establishing relationships among named places. And so what's significant here, of course, are these circles with names in them, but even more so, these lines of networks connecting those places to one another. This is another way of thinking about that topos world, this idea that places make meaning in combination with other places, in networks where the whole network is meaningful and where the lines are as significantly meaningful as the points which they connect. And a third related point, I'm not sure whether the number is third, a next related point to all of these is the idea that there's never just one meaning for a place, and there's never just one name for a place. And this is the point, again, that I've been emphasizing throughout this talk, and I'm now circling back to, that individual places have multiple meanings to different people, that places make meaning in relationship to one another, in combination with each other, in networks. And moving on, sort of kind of my next proposition from those points is that therefore, in the context of this what is in a name series, is that it means that places have multiple names. Once you affirm the idea that places have multiple meanings, that they exist in networks, that they exist in itineraries, they literally have different names, either successively or even at the same time. And this is one of my favorite examples of that. I'm going to be talking about a place in the Gulf of Boothia. And this is from a map from 1855, the map of the Arctic and adjacent regions by Sir John Ross, who was a British Arctic explorer. And this is an extraordinary image on the upper right. I don't know anything, I know of no other image like this one. So what Captain John Ross did as he explored the Arctic was to travel from place to place, and in each place he went, and if you can see on this map on the left, this is the entire circumpolar Arctic, right? So this is North America, Europe, and Asia. He constructed that whole map over a voyage of several years. And each place he went, he would find indigenous people, he would sit down with them, and you can see a watercolor painting representing this exact activity. And he would say, okay, so, show me where we are, right? And they would tell stories, topos type stories, they would make sketches, right? And that would create something like this on the bottom. This is the sketch map that John Ross's cartographers made one by one as he moved around the world. And in each of these sketch maps, as you can see here, almost all of the names have been stripped off. Whatever names Ikmalikik and Tigashu were saying as they told their story about their homeland have been effaced. The region is now called the Gulf of Boothia, right? A name that Captain John Ross ascribed to it. There are a couple of other place names, Kings William's Land, Melville Peninsula, right? No indigenous names, and yet this is described here as the chart drawn by the natives, right? And then from many, many, many of these maps, one gets an image like the one you see on the left. And I think I have, right, and there's Boothia, just for a sense of scale. Right? So thousands and thousands over years of acts of conversation, of dialogue, of sharing notions of how one creates place, of stripping off names, and then going through a process of renaming. And so when we talk about place names, we're talking about processes like this. You can look at this same place in a different way. This is another one of my very favorite cartography projects and placemaking projects. This is by a cartographer, an indigenous cartographer named Margaret Wickens Pierce, and she traveled around Canada talking to indigenous people and saying, what do you call this place? And repopulated a map of all of Canada. I've just zoomed in on this one region with the names that she learned. And in some cases, with the information that people would not share those names, right? This map also includes we know there's a name here, but we are not allowed to know that name. But in this case, once again, there we are in the Gulf of Boothia, the lake where the kayak is used. It is near the place where the Canada goose lays eggs. It's near a place where you can make or leave a kajak, or where you can give a command to your dog sled when you're hunting caribou. This is exactly the same region that was stripped of names like that, right? It's a way where names make meaning in context. They're indexical, if you remember that term that I introduced, and where instead of those indexical names that are meaningful in a settler context, this is now repopulated with a set of names that make sense in a very, very different cultural context. There's so many ways of making names and of documenting names, and closer to my personal expertise is this example of a Chinese historical gazetteer. This one is from the 17th century, and this is a there are thousands and thousands of these. There are about 8,000 of these created during the Chinese historical era. Our library here at Pitt actually holds the largest collection of the contemporary version of these anywhere outside China. This is a really, really deep and long and widespread Chinese tradition, is to have encyclopedias named after one place, often administrative units, sometimes Buddhist temple complexes, right, to have entire encyclopedic works just to define what that place is and what is meaningful about it, of course, from one particular perspective. And all I want to say about this here, I could talk for hours about these, they're amazing. What I want to point out here is that there is one whole chapter, right? Chapter 1 here is called the Diyu Zhi, right? It is just like the chapter about the location. And it includes it includes 10 different ways of basically defining how do we know that this place is here, including its administrative history, its boundaries, the villages within the county that this whole encyclopedia is about, and so on. And so this act of placemaking, this is a case where there's one name, it is the name of one county, and yet it takes sort of 10 different modalities, 10 different kinds of epistemologies to answer to the satisfaction of this author. And I should say this is not an atypical example. This is a very, very conventional example. This is very typical. It takes sort of 10 different modalities just to introduce in one chapter, what is this place? Where is this place? And so I want to now introduce, in the context of just thinking about making place complicated, making place names complicated, I now want to talk about a genre called gazetteers. And gazetteer is sort of a fancy word for something pretty simple, which is a thesaurus of place names. And I hope that what I have done so far in this talk is to kind of introduce the proposition that some things that sound like a boring reference work at some level, like we know what thesauruses are and place names, whatever, right? That actually doing the work of putting together multiple names associated with place, thinking again of place about being this sort of tripartite thing, right? A term, a location, and some sense of meaning making. That putting together a reference work that aggregates that kind of information can be an extraordinary window into thinking about history, about power, and about authority. And so I think that's really the main point I want to make on this slide. I wrote a book about this. I edited a book about this, placing names, enriching and integrating gazetteers. If anyone is curious to find out more about my perspective and that of some of my co-authors, and then a couple of examples of the fact that one of the things that happens to places is that they maintain their names, they maintain something of their sense of identity, and yet they can actually also move in location. The Mississippi River being one excellent example, a number of its historical courses, a famous and beautiful map, and a map of the various things that have been called Poland as it has come in and out of existence. I want to also use this moment to acknowledge the presence of my close collaborator and friend, Carl Grossner, who is the research developer. There's Carl, developer, software developer, and technical director of the World Historical Gazetteer project that I will be talking about in a little while. One of the people from whom I have most learned about the kinds of topics I'm talking about here today, and also for the purposes of this slide. This slide is partly stolen from one of Carl's presentations, so I extra want to acknowledge Carl for that reason. So thank you for this Mississippi map and Poland map also. So why might you want to have a gazetteer? And this is a slide, I'm pivoting now towards the World Historical Gazetteer, and I'll say in this context that the work that Carl and I are doing in the World Historical Gazetteer is to create a software platform, a resource, a suite of tools that allows many different databases of gazetteers, many different place name thesauruses to be searched and used together, right? So to create this kind of, over time, as it grows, this sort of multivocal world of allowing for many different versions of information about places to coexist. And this is one interesting example of what you can do once you have a digital version of a gazetteer that scales up to the whole world. The search I did here was for the term Santa, right? Santa Ana, Santa Cruz, right? And what you discover if you just do a sort of a search for any place that includes the text string Santa is that you get a global map of places that have been subjected to Spanish colonialism, right? You get lots of Santas on the Iberian Peninsula. You get lots of Santas in Spanish-speaking, though not Portuguese-speaking Latin America, and you get some Santas in the Philippines. And so just as you can sort of drill down into individual places and see how individual places might make meaning differently depending on your names, you can also scale up to the whole world and see what a map of the globe looks like if you start to populate it with place name information. You can look at one place, Beijing. See, and this is not from the World Historical Gazetteer. I actually have one missing slide. I submitted my slides yesterday, and I realized I did not have my Beijing in the World Historical Gazetteer slide, but imagine something like that here. But you can see the many different names that one place has been called over time, and the role of a gazetteer database, right, a digital version of the kind of information that I started out this talk thinking about theoretical and conceptual questions. This is also something that we can think about as an act of formal data modeling. Who has called this place something? When have they called it that? What do we know about the fact that they've called it that? Where does that information come from? When did that place name exist? What else did it coexist with? What can we say about the meaning-making events that caused that place to be known by that name, right? How have its other characteristics changed? Its location, it's the type of place that it is. Is it a capital or just a city, right? All of those are the kinds of things that it's possible to do in a gazetteer database like the ones that we're now designing for the World Historical Gazetteer. This is the end of my talk. Again, just sort of my trajectory here, my hope has been to start with kind of troubling the idea of places, to think about what's in a name, to take this question of the series really seriously, and to think about this not just as a sort of kind of aphorism, but what really is in a name. If we think about place, what are we saying if we do a significant focus on the topic of place names? And to end with this idea that we can think about that conceptually, we can think about it ethically and politically, and we can start to design digital tools that instantiate some of those ideas. So let me thank you all for your time, invite you to visit the World Historical Gazetteer. It's live on the web, whgazetteer.org. And let me turn the mic over to Keila Grinberg.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank the Global Hub for hosting this event, and also the partnership with the World History Center and all the UCIS centers in the What's in a Name series. It's a real honor to share the stage with Ruth here today to talk about the What's in a Name series. And what I'm going to do is just, in some ways, explore with a concrete example what we can do if we investigate or if you ask some questions, as she was doing with names like Beijing and other names related to places, and trouble a little bit or go further in our thinking about names. So this first image is from, it's an image from Bahia, Brazil, and that lake, it's sort of a lake, it's called Caçange, as we can read in the boat. And the Caçange beach and lake is this astonishing, beautiful place that I happened to be once when I was in a vacation. I had no idea that I would, I was in the south of Bahia, and then I found out that there was a beach called Caçange. I was very struck by that. I was struck because I knew that, so this is where Caçange is in the state of Bahia in the coast of Brazil. And I was puzzled by Caçange, the name, because I also knew that there was, and there still is, a very poor neighborhood in Salvador, the capital of Bahia, Brazil, named Caçange. So this is the location of the neighborhood in the city of Salvador, in the capital of Bahia. And the reason why, because of my expertise in the history of Atlantic slavery, the reason why I was so puzzled by the name Caçange related to a beach in the south of Bahia and to a neighborhood in Salvador was the fact that I knew that Caçange was also a name of a place in Angola. So then I was like, okay, why we have a beach, a lake, a neighborhood named Caçange, all those places named Caçange, when I knew that Caçange is a place in the countryside of Angola. And here you can see where Caçange is, sort of in the north of Angola, and there, the Caçange beach there in the other side of the Atlantic. So, of course, it's easy for us to imagine the connections, the possible connections between Caçange, Angola, and Caçange, Bahia, which are, this is a map of 17th century Angola, and Caçange here, written in a slightly different way, and that I want to point out precisely for the reasons that Ruth was pointing out too, that the various names and ways in which we write a name matters there too. But in the 17th century, Caçange was the largest market of human beings in Angola. This was the largest slave market in Angola. And just to point out, the capital, Luanda, is over there. And from the 16th century on until the 17th century, Caçange became a sort of a border between what the Portuguese would call the civilized, conquered lands and the ones where they felt that they could enslave people. So this was a very big, huge slave market where people would be sold and taken either to Luanda or to the port of Ambriz in the north or to the port of Benguela in the south, and they would be taken to several places in the Americas. And Brazil was the main destination for the ones who were enslaved around Caçange and that left Angola to Brazil, specifically to the ports of Salvador and the surroundings, to the ports in the north of Pernambuco and in the ports of Rio. Just for you to have an idea, only to Bahia, only to Bahia, not considering any other region, about 670,000 people, enslaved Africans, disembarked and were enslaved there. If you count the whole country, that number goes up to the millions, just from Angola, not counting the rest of Africa. But that gives us a context of the name Kasanje. That doesn't explain much, I think, about why are we naming a beach and a neighborhood after a slave market. Why people would do that? And we can raise several questions related to that. There are several other names that connect Portuguese Africa to Portuguese Brazil, but I was still very struck with the idea that Kasanje is this big, huge slave market from the 17th to 19th century, and it's naming this beach, naming this neighborhood in Brazil. So actually, I think that if we go back to the story of the place, we can start raising different hypotheses or thinking about the name of this place in a sort of more complex way. So when we get closer to the history of Angola in the 17th century, and I'm sorry, as I was looking at your PowerPoint, Ruth, I realized that I didn't put the references for this map, the right one, and that's the basic mistake that you, the students, cannot do. So this wasn't my mistake. It's just an example of things that you can do. It's actually my mistake, and I'm sorry about that. This is a 17th century map that shows the different kingdoms that are today's Angola. And here you can see the País de Jaga, Kasanje, which Kasanje is located. I don't know, I will move here a little bit just to show. I know that I can't move, but just to show here. You can see the kingdom of Matamba with another reference to Jaga, Le Jaga. And you can see the kingdom of Dongo, right in the middle, this small kingdom here. And to the coast, in the direction of the coast, we see what was Angola then. What that means? That means that in the 16th and in the 17th century, this was an area of several war and conflicts over the territory, but also over enslavement. Who could enslave who, and who could sell the persons to the Portuguese or also to the Dutch who invaded the area in the 17th century as well, and who could control the Kasanje market. So, of course, we're not going deep into the 17th century history of Angola, but just the point that I want to make here is that this territory was a territory of conflict, and one of the main conflicts was between the kingdoms of Kasanje, the kingdoms of Matamba, and the kingdoms of Dongo. And those were composed by the so-called Jagas or Imbangalas, who are known, at least in the popular culture, as being these big warriors and these persons that would resist against the Portuguese colonization, resist against the Dutch colonization. And in fact, there is a very interesting story about the Queen Zinga, or Nzinga, who was the queen of the kingdom of Matamba, that the Portuguese were only able to conquer Ndongo and Kasanji after establishing this alliance with her and her entourage. And again, this is a 1657 image. This is a Dutch image, and it's very interesting how it shows I love this image, how it shows the court and the image of a warrior connected to that kingdom. So all the Imbangala and Jaga warriors, we do not know much about their origins, but we do know that they were seen as people that would resist slavery. Even so, they were enslaved, and many of them were sent to Bahia, Brazil. The name Imbangala and the name Jaga and the name Kasanji remained connected to stories of resistance and stories of enslavement and stories of struggle against Portuguese colonialism. A thing that I learned yesterday while I was preparing this is that in the 1961 wars of decolonization of Angolans against the Portuguese, there was a Kasanji strike against the Portuguese. And if you Google Kasanji, that's the first thing you're going to find, not the 17th century wars. So here's another two images of the Jagas, two from the New York Public Library. And my point here is to show how the Jaga is a sort of a Portuguese name for the Imbangalas. So the Imbangalas is the original name. Again, different names that relate to the same people, that relate to a specific place. They are always, always portrayed by the Europeans as warriors, as people that were powerful, as people that somehow would resist to the colonialism and slavery. So I guess that now you know already where I'm going. What's in the name of Kasanji? I don't know, and I don't think we can know why that beach, the lake, and the neighborhood in Salvador were associated with Kasanji. We don't have an answer for that. Maybe we'll have some time. But what we know is that by investigating the association of a name to a place, we can know a lot about the story of resistance to colonialism and enslavement in Angola. We can learn a lot, maybe, about the story of resistance to slavery in Brazil. Many of those warriors were found later on in Bahia. And in fact, if we look at another database that we will be talking about tomorrow, we're already inviting you to a roundtable, which will be a continuation of this discussion. If you're not tired of Ruth and I, you can see Carl and also our research partner, Darren Williams, that will talk about the enslaved database. If you look at a database of African names in Brazil that are related to Kasanji somehow, we find more than 400 names from the 17th to the 19th century. So what we have in Kasanji? We have a connection, a direct connection between Brazil, Bahia and Angola, the specific place in Brazil and a specific place in Angola. And that name can tell us a story that it's not obvious at all for us, but it can be explored in a historical way, and it can be meaningful for the people who lived in those communities, for the people that relate to those names somehow. Kasanji is a name, a surname, that we still find in Bahia. What that means, what kind of meanings, what kind of relationships to Africa, to the African origins that can bring to them I don't know, but those are questions that are interesting for us to ask. And maybe we could, by taking that example as, let's say, a research initiative, if we keep going to those places and asking, what does Kassanji mean to you? What that brings to your mind? We could go further and think about the sort of the popular ways that people connect name and places. So I don't want to keep talking too much because maybe we should engage in a conversation. So that I think that this was the last one. Yeah. So this was an example of many other African names that we find in Brazil, but specifically, that's an example of resistance to colonialism and resistance to enslavement. So maybe that's also a way for us to bring a counter narrative of slavery in Brazil that actually focuses on the individuals and their actions against slavery than the main narrative which focuses on colonialism and the colonial powers. So thank you very much, and I guess that will continue the discussion. Sure. Okay. So how will we do with that?
Yeah, I think how about you two sit up here? You can keep this mic on. It should pick up Ruth as well. Just sit close together. So now we'll take some time for some Q&A. If anyone has questions, you can raise your hand. I'm going to kind of take the mic around. Anyone have any questions?
We can.
Did you speak Portuguese? Take a part the name Kassanji. It's Latin. Angie. Well, Portuguese is based on Latin, as you know. Angie, angel, cassia, casa. Casa in Latin, that's a proper name. You take it from the Greek goddess. So it could be, you asked about where that name come from. I think it came from Portuguese, which came from Latin, which came from Greek. It's my own personal opinion. What do you think? Where did that name come from? Is it a Portuguese translation?
For Kassanji?
Yes.
I have never heard. Thank you. I mean, I'm just following your thread, and I think this is that's yes, that could be interesting. Then, because I think that Kassanji is an African Bantu name, which is the language of that part of Africa.
Yes.
So what you're bringing is another hypothesis, which would be a Portuguese-related name. Maybe it is. I have not seen this in a Portuguese context, but now I'll take a look. That would be interesting to follow.
Yeah, because when I see the name, I see Greek and I see Latin. Which is a guess. I don't know. It could be something.
I will explore that. Yeah. Thanks.
Is there any question I have?
Yeah, I was going to say that I have questions.
And I was wondering if a huge famous historic neighborhood like that is named after some sort of historical identify or have some sort of public knowledge about the names of these places. Because I just asked Fabiana, I said, what does Pellegrino mean again in Portuguese? And I was like, is there a translation of that? Not really.
But
It's such a famous neighborhood, so how come there's not more public knowledge about it? That's where you can come from.
Can I show something?
Yeah.
No, I mean, are we connected to the web or no?
We connect to the internet.
I was just going to show you Pelourinho. So while I Google Pelourinho, this is the name of the historical neighborhood in here. It's just for everyone to see what is this historical neighborhood in the heart of Salvador. And it's interesting, and it's a great counterexample that we're actually giving, because Pelourinho means the place where the enslaved were beaten, or, I mean, mainly beaten or put in sort of public castigo. No, not display. Pillory? Yeah, so that's what Pelourinho means. And there are several, this is a neighborhood, but there are several places around Brazil that are called Pelourinho. But that relates to the actual counterexample because it refers to the violence of slavery and not the opposite. So you just came with, I came with this one that sort of may bring us to resistance, I'm not sure. And this one, it's more of like the everyday life of slavery.
I have a question, if there's no questions from the audience. So, because we were hoping that, so I want to say one of the things that's so exciting to me about this event is that Keila and I have spent a lot of time just sort of talking back and forth with each other about our ideas on these questions, projects we might do together. So this is a really exciting opportunity to start to take our conversations public, and we will continue that again tomorrow. So in that context, one of the things I was thinking while you were talking, Keila, about what is so interesting about Kasanji is the number of different things that it is, right? The number, right? In my talk, I was stressing that a name is sort of a string of text, right? That's part of what it means to talk about names. And that Kasanji is, I really noticed that it is a surname. Mm-hmm. It's a name for a group of people, right? It's what we can call an ethnonym, right? They're people known as the Kasanji people. It's the name of a kingdom. It's the name of a market. It's the name of a beach and a neighborhood. Some of those things are places. Some of them are things that are similar to places, although not quite, like the ethnonym. And then some of them have somehow gotten free of place altogether and have become the names of people, of individual people, family names. And then in addition to all of that, it seems like it's maybe a sort of a metaphor. Mm-hmm. And so, so this is, of course, this is more a comment than a question as the term goes. But it's interesting to think not just about the way that place names move from place to place, but also about how terms can kind of get loose from place altogether and be so many different other kinds of evocative things. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts or comments about that.
This is wonderful because, one of the discussions that we are actually talking about, and I think it's worth exploring, is the idea that Kasanji, the name related to people, like a family name, we don't know in the past if the people that were called Kasanji, if they were called Kasanji because they were bought or originally from Kasanji, the place, or because there was a specific identity that connected them to the name and they were called Kasanji. And this is a common discussion when we talk about African names and the names that come, that we find, let's say, in Brazil, but we can refer to them in other places in the Americas. What a name means, and we'll never get to a conclusion in the sense that we don't, I want to insist on that we don't know the answer, but we know much about exploring that. I think that just following on that, I think that one very valuable activity that we can do if we go back, it's go back to the people and ask what that means. And I'm very concretely thinking about the public ways that we can use that discussion. Because this discussion is very interesting for our purposes, historical purposes, research purposes, but it's also interesting if we apply this and approach the communities and think and ask, what do you think that these names means? What you can tell us about yourself when you explain the origin of a name or of a name related to a place. And I guess that's an interesting point, is that those meanings change over time. So in my research, when we go and ask that kind of question to the communities of the descendants of the enslaved Africans who lived in the coast, they will give different meanings over time for the same names. And I guess that's, again, it relates to your theoretical explanation of the fact that there's no name, objective name, related to an objective place without the human interaction. So the fact that maybe, I don't know, 50 years ago, people in Kassanji would relate this to the market in Angola. Now that we have much more awareness about resistance and we know much more about the history of Portuguese Angola, they would refer to the story of resistance. And both are true. So I think that's probably the beauty, one of the beauties of exploring those meanings. We have questions.
So the world, the historical the World Historical
The World Historical Gazetteer.
Gazetteer.
Yep.
To what extent does that include like nicknames?
Include what?
Nicknames.
Nicknames.
Like local nicknames that people from that place call that place.
Right. So right at the moment, I don't think it has a lot of that kind of information, but the way it is designed is that it's intended to grow on the basis of user contribution. And we would be eager, and the idea is that over time, as we get more and more user contributions, we will have a wider range of terms that refer to the same place or interrelated places. And I think, for the reasons that Keila was saying, some of these projects of going to local people in different places, talking to them, figuring out what they call places, we would be really eager to add that sort of content. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Carl.
Well, coincidentally, we don't.
I was wondering about that.
Eagerly await Keila's contribution on Twitter that will add it. Variants that we find in her research that might relate to it will join that particular name in that record and be searchable and findable. So anybody searching for any variation finds the core record and all of the attestations from other sources.
So one question that I have, it's question common too, but it's something that I think sometimes when we do those very wide digital projects is about what we gain in terms of knowledge when we put all this information together. And maybe this will be a good occasion for us to think, let's say in the Santa example that you gave. We know that Santa is, there are various names in Spanish, in Portuguese, in other Latin languages that use Santa, Santa Maria, Santa, So what we don't know that we can actually know when you use a platform like that. I mean, for historical purposes or, for the advance of our knowledge about something, what we gain. And I think this is interesting, not only because, for some of us who are interested in a specific topic, but for maybe for the ones who want to think more deeply about their own places. So what we gain?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think, you referenced the Santa example that I used. And one thing that you can do is, in fact, to sort of zoom out and see global patterns that might not be visible otherwise. And, historical gazetteer research, and I think your research is a really perfect example of this, Keila. This has really technical, specialized, expert research in a lot of cases. It's finding one name or a handful of names and doing this really deep, ethnographic research or research in historical sources. And so everybody who is thinking deeply about historical names is able to think only about a pretty small number of all the names that exist in the world, right? And it is only by aggregating together the work of multiple specialists that you can start to see these kinds of patterns or resonances occur, whether it's seeing the same name existing across a wide area of the earth, or whether it's seeing different names that exist for the same place, as in, for instance, that Gulf of Plutia example that I presented. And so I think it's really, the thing that really keeps me going throughout this large-scale, long-term, it's really hard work doing a project like this, and a lot of it is, in infrastructure rather than in historical research that historians love to do. And the thing that really keeps me going and gets me up in the morning to keep doing this hard work is that it's possible, that it's decolonial, right? It's at least the promise of it is exactly to do the kind of thing that you and I are talking about here, right? To, a name seems so permanent, or a place seems so permanent. That Columbus statue that I talked about seemed like it was going to be there forever until suddenly it wasn't anymore, right? And so by doing the work of creating place name indexes, of bringing together place name indexes, ultimately what this is doing is reminding people in different kinds of ways that the things that seem like they always have to be that way don't necessarily have to be that way. So I think that part of the work is a really significant reason to do this kind of aggregation, as well as just simply to bring together people's knowledge, to recognize that it's going to take hundreds of people with their own different expertise to really start to populate the world with information about names that it's been known as in the past, or to allow multiple different names to coexist. One of the examples that Carl and I in our meetings have been talking about all week is Kiev versus Kyiv, right? To use an example that's certainly in the news right now, where Kiev is the Russian pronunciation, Kyiv is the Ukrainian pronunciation, and by putting those names next to each other, we start to surface information about history and about power relations in a way that isn't possible if you think about places as being known by only one thing at a given time.
Parallels that you did.
I was talking about the capital of Ukraine.
Here.
Yes.
Yes.
Strong over me, family strong. And this is why I'm so interested in this topic. And to know me, and
This is a great question because when I was just going back to the communities or the public use of this, one of the things that I have in mind is that nowadays that kind of work that Ruth is doing is also very meaningful for the ones who are searching for their own origins in a way that is not obvious. Not everyone, and very few people actually have like a family tree that they could go back, and you can, the DNA will tell you different things than the exploration of a name, but when you see a name referred to as a different meaning that you are used to, it can give new meanings for you. So one example is the name Costa, the Portuguese name, which is a very, very common name in Brazil, Costa. And Costa, like coast, refers to the African coast, Costa da África, and then became Costa. And it's a Portuguese name now. But the research on names shows that Costa, coast, is from that area in Africa. So it doesn't tell necessarily that your family is from this area, but it may reverse some negative ideas that some people have about African origin. So I think that the individual or the family search is interesting in that sense, because you can think about your own origins in a slightly different way. And that maybe that has a different meaning than the DNA, because the DNA it's not straightforward either, but it relates to a different sort of database, but it can have I think, a different meaning. Manuel?
And even when there's family names that are kept, right? Paternal family, even paternal father. So we lose structure and legacy just by keeping our last name from this. Not the same colonialism. It's large dominant mode, right? So going by our last name.
To understand what's Kasanji in Brazil and how much of Kasanji from Africa we have in Brazil and why. What about the other way around? How much of Kasanji from Brazil has reached back and traveled back to the people of Kasanji in Africa? So that we know that unification, lives, and history travels back and forth. I was just curious to see, how much you go back. Are they aware? Are they not aware?
This is also a great question. I don't have the specific answer for Kasanji, but one thing that we know is that in the second half of the 19th century, so after the Atlantic slave trade was prohibited in Brazil, 1850, many Africans, and this is a very unknown story, but many Africans were able to return. And they, in various circumstances, they rented boats. The British rented ships for them to return. And when we look at the names, they would arrive with Brazilian, sort of Portuguese, Catholic Brazilian names in places where they were not from there. So Benin was a common destination for those retornados, the ones that returned. And what we know is that they left Brazilian names in Benin in a way that some neighborhoods are now called Santa something and have Catholic names. And they have the Costa surname, not because they were from the coast of Africa, but because of the ones who returned from Brazil. So it's that question of circulation is super interesting because it's a historical process. It's a process of identity. What happens to those individuals once they go back from their experience of enslavement to Africa, but to an Africa that they never knew, not only because most of them were not born there, but because they went to a very different place, but they carried a different name. And by carrying a different name, they were seen as totally different people. This happened in Luanda too, but because they were Portuguese speakers in Luanda as well, the names integrated more. So the case of Benin Daomé, they were more common as that strangeness that you still find today between those experiences of enslavement in 19th century and the return and how they clashed with these African cultures.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Keila. It's really fascinating. So I'm an environmental historian, so I'm kind of thinking about how you're thinking about place name in relationship to environment, in relationship to non-human. Keila, in particular, I mean, you were talking about Bahia, right, which is a beach, right? So you have this kind of power relation playing out on this like natural landscape. Of the rivers and the environment in general. So I'm just kind of curious to hear you guys maybe just talk a little bit about how you incorporate non-human nature when you're thinking about places, and like in particular how to make sure that like the environment is not just like a passive factor, it's like an active thing in this whole kind of and stuff like that.
Thank you so much for that question. What I was thinking about as you were talking is that, for the last number of years, I've sort of had two different tracks in my brain of research topics. One is this work on historical place names from the World Historical Gazetteer, and another one is the long history, 3,000-year history of the Yellow River in China. And literally, until your question, I have always thought of these as being quite unrelated tracks in my brain, but of course they're not because it's all one brain. The argument of my Yellow River book, which was recently published, is that the way to look at a river is not as sort of a line of water flowing in a channel, but as its whole watershed, right? Which in the case of the Yellow River entrains, essentially almost the entirety of North China, and is a story about water, but is also a story about wind and rain, and is very fundamentally a story about soil, and is a story about thousands of years of complex human activities about war and geopolitics and commodification and of trees and a whole range of topics, not to mention a story about fish and birds, although that story is not a clear focus for me. And, what I realized kind of only in a flash as you were asking your question is why is it that I think that sort of whole watershed approach is so important? And I've always kind of thought of it as being important, as me saying it's important because it's the right story to tell as a work of environmental history, but it's also the right story to tell as a story of place name history, because every place within the watershed is, in a fundamental sense, a part of what it means, right? I talked about place as having the element of a geospatial location, a label, and a sense of place, or a series, wide range, millions of senses of places and events associated with place. And the Yellow River, especially for the last 1,000 years, has very frequently flooded and very frequently changed its course. And so to see that place only as one line of water flowing through one channel does a disservice both as a work of environmental history and as a work of place name history, toponymy, right, as the word goes. And so these things are really fundamentally related. And I'll say one more thing, which is that I just co-authored an article with one of my other collaborators that is forthcoming in a book about digital humanities and environmental history. And the argument that we're making in that article is basically that so many spatial history projects, right, you start with a base map and then you put some thoughts on top of it. And in fact, I showed plenty of those maps. I am very much not immune from that form of cartography. But in fact, if you think of the environment and environmental change as being some of those place-making and place-transforming events, if you think of the sort of agentful nature, right, of the environment, that is, the environment itself drives, historical causality, then you really fundamentally have to disrupt how you think about cartography. And, in fact, I always try not to go too far off the deep end in this way, but I'm very suspicious of maps relative to gazetteers and databases. And part of the reason is because gazetteers and other sort of model databases allow for so much more of the sort of the kind of flexibility and ambiguity that text permits, while still also allowing for formal modeling. On a map, you draw a line, you label it as a river, and that's that. Whereas in a gazetteer, you can have an entity called the Yellow River, and if you want to go through this sort of the complex work that, right, you can include its whole watershed. You can include all of the floods that have occurred along it. You can include all of the courses that it's taken, and all of those collectively can represent one entity that isn't just the sort of a river as a sort of a base map on top of which things happen, but that those activities themselves constitute what the river is. So it's a long answer. You asked one of my favorite questions, so thank you very much for that.
I was just thinking, as you were saying about being suspicious of maps, that probably we could say the same about the names, in the sense of also the names, they hide things at the same time as they show. So if we don't, let's say, I guess that the answer is that we need to focus on the human interaction, which produces the names, produces the maps, and our perception of the environment. And I was thinking about, as a person who also loves maps and can stay hours and hours looking at it, if you put them on top of each other, maps of the same place from various times on top of each other, of course you're not seeing everything that you're describing, for instance, about the Yellow River, but you can see very different ways to relate to that environment and to that story. So in some ways, this sort of old definition of geohistory is still on me in that connection of what do we gain when we have a spatial notion of history, and what do we gain when we have a historical approach to geography. And maybe that's, that connection is still something valid when you look at the environment and how it's named and over time.
I want to add one more sentence. One thing that, one interesting thing to note about the Yellow River is that the name Yellow River only became the most commonly used name for that body of water about, 15, a little more than 1,000 years ago. And prior to that, it was known most often as the Great River rather than Yellow River. And that's partly because it was yellow, right? It was as a result of, of human activity, environmentally transformative activity river, that its name changed. And so this relationship between environmental change, spatial change, name change, that's one other really extraordinary example of how to think about that.
Well, we're just almost out of
Well, thank you. Thank you.